I recently watched a really good video about the causes of the American Revolution. It was made by a filmmaker named Andrew Rakich, and the video was called The Real Cause of the Revolutionary War. Overall, the video was excellent. It helped dispel some myths about the founding of our country. On the other hand, it made much of another set of myths, this time about the Puritans, who were some of our country's first founders. The anti-religious bigotry so popular among academia is on full display in this video. In it, Rakich refers to the Puritans as sex-deprived weirdos, though he does acknowledge that Puritanism was the wellspring of some of our most foundational ideas about liberalism, including universal male suffrage, republicanism, and the consent of the governed. These, Rakich acknowledges, were originally their ideas. However, rather than celebrating what they accomplished, he portrays them as having failed to implement their ideas and having fumbled as founders. He says they were ideologically ill-equipped for bringing this kind of society about. Why? Well, because they were an apocalyptic doomsday cult. They thought their political and cultural dominance was the harbinger of end times. And apocalyptic doomsday cults aren't exactly the best long-term planners. The Puritans restructured the English state into a vehicle for bringing about the New Jerusalem, a fundamentally irrational goal that proved unsustainable. And of course, they failed to do the same thing in New England, where their ideas failed even more completely. While portraying the Puritans as a fanatical, anti-sex, doomsday cult is certainly in vogue these days, it is an inaccurate and an unfair way of talking about some of the first architects of modern democracy. Of course, they were unable to think in terms of 21st century American pluralism, but they were well ahead of their own time, and by quite a lot. And they were not unique in not being able to predict or control the future. All founding groups suffer from these same constraints of time. Once ideas are set in motion, they always take paths somewhat different from what the originators intended. A careful reading of the historical sources, including those found in the following books: The Puritans, A Captivating History, Thomas Watson's The Art of Contentment, and Joel R. Bean's fine work, Following God Fully, reveal a much more complex and nuanced view of the Puritans, one that emphasizes their devotion to faith, family, and civic responsibility rather than extreme fanaticism. I'll start by saying the Puritans were a people of faith, not fanaticism. The claim that the Puritans were an apocalyptic cult misrepresents their theological outlook. While it is true that they believed in the sovereignty of God and the importance of living righteously, they did not constantly expect the world's imminent end. The Puritans, A Captivating History, discusses their eschatology, showing that while they were aware of biblical warnings about final judgment, their focus was on shaping a godly society. Their establishment of educational institutions such as Harvard College in 1636 demonstrates a long-term vision rather than a doomsday obsession. Moreover, Puritan theology was deeply rooted in the Reformed tradition, emphasizing both divine providence and human responsibility. They sought to purify the Church of England of perceived corruptions, but this was more about returning to biblical principles than engaging in cult-like extremism. Their sermons and writings do not reflect irrational fanaticism, but rather a disciplined, systematic theology engaging the world of their time. Secondly, let something be said about the Puritans and sexuality, giving a balanced perspective. The accusation that the Puritans were a prudish, anti-sexual cult is another misconception that is often exaggerated. Thomas Watson's The Art of Contentment provides insight into how Puritans viewed marriage and intimacy. Contrary to the stereotype of extreme repression, Watson and other Puritan writers praised marital love and sexual intimacy within the proper context of marriage. They viewed it as a gift from God and an essential part of human flourishing. Furthermore, court records from New England indicate that Puritans actively punished adultery and fornication, not because they were anti-sex, but because they believed that the sanctity of marriage was important to the health of community. They recognized sexual desire as natural, but sought to direct it toward godly purposes. Puritan ministers wrote extensively about the joys and duties of married life, emphasizing mutual love, respect, and even pleasure within the marriage. And finally, the Puritans were not isolationists, but builders of society. The claim that the Puritans were cult-like in their approach to the world ignores their lasting contributions to civic life. In Following God Fully, Joel R. Bean argues that Puritans were deeply engaged in shaping communities based on biblical principles of justice, mercy, and order. They did not isolate themselves in small radical enclaves. Rather, they built towns, created systems of governance, and established legal structures that would influence American democracy for centuries. Of course, what they could not fully anticipate was how that course would also be guided by others as new immigrants took their part in the American experiment. Further, the Puritans' emphasis on literacy and education, as evidenced by their high rates of book ownership and literacy laws, demonstrates a commitment to an informed and virtuous society rather than to blind obedience and authoritarian rule. Unlike cults, which typically discourage independent thought, Puritans encouraged theological debate and deep study of the scriptures. This can be readily demonstrated by pointing to a debate that would take place within the Puritan community between the Old Lights and the New Lights, which were parties in a theological debate over the role of experience within theological exploration. Conclusion: more accurate view of the Puritans. Andrew Ruckhick's characterization of the Puritans as a fanatical, anti-sex, doomsday cult is an oversimplification that ignores the rich and historical theological legacy of these early settlers, as seen in the Puritans, A Captivating History, The Art of Contentment, and Following God Fully. The Puritans were not radical extremists, but rather devout, disciplined Christians who sought to create a moral and just society. Their emphasis on education, family, and civic responsibility had lasting effects on the American culture and governance. Rather than dismiss them with modern biases, we should seek to understand them in their own historical and religious context. Psalm 33:12 says, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people he chooses for his inheritance."